Hi, I'm Andrew Connell, and I'm an MVP with Office Servers and Services. In this module, we're going to look at how we can develop with the SharePoint Framework, and specifically, we're going to work with web parts, and we're also going to explore a SharePoint Framework project. Specifically in this section, we're going to look at an anatomy of a SharePoint Framework project, the solution lifecycle, and then how we can go about creating client-side web parts. Let's talk about the project structure of a brand new SharePoint Framework project. I'm going to walk through these different folders here one by one. The .vs code folder is really has nothing to do with the SharePoint Framework itself. All it is it just contains Visual Studio Code specific integration files. The config folder includes all configuration files. This is where we're going to use things for not only configuring our web part, but mostly it's going to be configuring stuff in the build process. The dist folder, the lib folder, and the temp folder, these are all temporary folders that are created when we do the build process, in the packaging process. These will never be checked in to your source control. The first one to look at is lib. Lib is created when I build the project, and that's what's going to take all of the TypeScript files, and it's going to create JavaScript files out of them. It's going to take Sass files or SCSS files and create CSS files out of them. That's like a temporary holding location. The dist folder is where we're going to store all of our builds. So once we've gone through and we've done a build where it's going to create this lib folder with all these temporary files, we then have to create something called a bundle, and that's going to package up all the CSS and JavaScript together in one file. That's what's going to be stored in the dist folder, and that's going to be there temporarily until we do the packaging. The node modules folder is going to be created automatically when you build your project, or really when you create the project and you run the package manager for you. It's going to contain all of the node modules or NPM packages that your solution relies on, as well as all of their dependencies. If you're familiar with server-side based .NET framework development, you can think of this as the packages folder. You would never store this inside of your source control. The source file, or the SRC folder, this is the main folder for your project. It's going to contain all of your code and all of your style sheets and all of the configuration stuff or metadata information about your components that you're creating. Now let's highlight a couple of the key files. We got the web part class. So in this case here, this will be in the src/webpart/ whatever the name of the web part is, and then the name of the web part.ts. This is going to define the main entry point for the web part, and it's going to extend the base client-side web part class. All client-side web parts must extend the base client-side web part class in order to be defined as a valid web part. This class will contain two things. It will contain not just the web part, but it will also contain an interface of all of the public properties that you would find on the web part that would be persisted by SharePoint. Then you've got the web part properties class, and that's inside of that TypeScript file for the web part itself. Originally, it was its own separate file, but Microsoft has merged those into the same file. This interface defines the non-standard public properties on the web part, and it'll be persisted when the web part is saved or published from edit mode. The manifest file is going to define the metadata for the web part. Things like the ID of the web part, the alias of it, what kind of a component it is and version it is, as well as a bunch of pre-configured entries. And these pre-configured entries are the settings on the public properties on the web part when it's created and added to the page. Now let's talk a little bit about CSS modules. CSS modules are addressing a challenge that we have inside of the SharePoint framework, and really not so much the SharePoint framework, but when we're working with client-side solutions. So what's going on here is that CSS is you can override a CSS class just by defining another class with the same name later on the page. So one of the ways that we can get around this of having and create like globally defined CSS classes is by giving them a special name. So like this underscore DA83FER, that's the name of the class that is coming from the Hello World class. Thankfully, the SharePoint framework is going to handle some of the complexities of how this is done. We're simply going to create a Sass file, and we're going to name it something.module.sass. So in this case here, hello world web part.module.sass. All the classes in there must use camel casing. They can't be kebab cased where there would be a hyphen between two parts of the CSS class name. You then would reference classes in the components using an object notation of styles.helloworld_button. So the way this works is that the build process, when I run gulp build, it's going to compile the Sass file down to CSS, and it's going to give it this extra suffix on each one of the class names. It's going to store that inside of the CSS file. So you'll see class names that look like what you see there in that one bullet point of hello world is really going to be hello world underscore some sort of a hash. It also is going to create a JavaScript file, and that JavaScript file is going to return back a single object named styles that's going to have name value properties for all of the classes. The names of each one of the properties is the actual CSS class name, and the value is going to be equal to the hashed name of the CSS class. Now, when you do that, what that's going to then allow you to do is that inside of your web part, you're going to be able to import this styles object and then say styles.helloworld, and it will know how to go grab the proper class name when it renders out the web part. You're going to get nice IntelliSense from this because in addition, the build process is also going to create a TypeScript type declaration file that's going to define all of those name value pairs. If you look at this Sass file, you can see here where what it has is I have a hello world, and then inside of that I have a container, a row, a column, title, subtitle, description, and button class. So here I'd be able to say styles.helloworld or styles.helloworldcontainer, and it will go through and find the proper CSS class name that was created for that with that hash. Now we have another file, a special configuration file that's pretty important in the config folder. It's called config.json. And what this does is it contains information about your bundles and any external dependencies and localized resources. Now you see here we have a bundles section, and what this does is this allows us to define the name of the bundle that's going to get created and what components should be in that bundle. And in this case here, I'm telling it only create a single bundle and only include the web part class or the web part JavaScript file that's been generated and any additional JavaScript files and libraries that it references. The manifest is where it's going to find the actual manifest for that item. The external section is where we're going to be able to define external libraries that we don't want to be sucked into the bundle when the bundle is created by Webpack. So for example, if I was using jQuery, I don't want to include jQuery inside of the JavaScript file that I'm deploying. Instead, I want to make sure that that JavaScript file is going to be referenced from an external CDN, and I would use the external section for that, and we'll see that in a later module. So let's look at the build flow for a client-side web part. We're first going to have to go set up our environment, which we would have already done. So that would be installing the generator and making sure Yeoman and Gulp and all that other stuff is installed. I then am going to run Yo SharePoint and answer a bunch of questions to tell the SharePoint Framework generator what I want to create, what kind of thing I want to create, and what type of some additional questions like if I want to use a web framework and what the name of it is and description, etc. Then, from the command line, I can type code space dot from the folder where I created the project, and that will launch Visual Studio Code and open up the folder inside VS Code. Then I want to go through and test out my web part after I've done some coding. So I can do gulp space serve, and what that will do is spin up a local web development experience, a local web server. It'll launch the browser, and it'll set up a local workbench to where I can then go through and add my web part to the local workbench on my laptop or on my developer environment and test it out. So here I can test it with the local workbench, and then I can also launch it out to a user acceptance testing and pre-production if I want to deploy it to a production environment and decide if this web part was now created in a way that I want to share it with everyone else. Now, once I've decided that it's now of going through the iterative development process, and I do want to go through and deploy this to production, I would then package up my solution by saying gulp space package solution. And that's going to create my SharePoint Framework component that I can then deploy to an app catalog in my SharePoint Online tenant or my SharePoint On-Prem tenant, and other people could then use my web part. So I create the package. I'm then going to potentially deploy any assets to an external CDN. It's not required because the SharePoint framework does give me the ability to include assets inside of the SharePoint framework package that's created. And then if I'm using SharePoint Online and I have the Office 365 CDN enabled, that will then take those assets like the JavaScript and CSS files and images and manifest files out of the package, and it will put them in the CDN for me. I then take this package that I've created and I will then upload it to the app catalog. And I can do this manually, or I can do this using some of the Office 365 and SharePoint Online ALM APIs, or commandlets inside of PowerShell, or commands from the Office 365 CLI to automate this process. And now once I've done that and I've deployed it to the app catalog and I've installed it, it will now be available for use on classic and client-side pages. Now we have a bunch of different tasks that are available to us inside of SharePoint development. We've got a clean task, and that's going to delete all the SharePoint Framework build folders and intermediate SAS files that were created. So it's effectively going to delete the dist folder, the lib folder, and the temp folder. Build is going to build the project. That's always going to be your first step. Now, if you don't put any name of a gulp task that you want to run, you just say gulp, it's going to run a default thing, which is going to say that it wants to do a bundle. So if you do gulp bundle, what that does is that's going to first run the build, and then it's going to bundle up the project. So build is going to create your JavaScript, transpile your TypeScript to JavaScript, your SAS to CSS, and create the manifest files. Bundle is then going to create the bundle from the CSS and the JavaScript files and the manifest file. You got a couple of things here that we have that are involved in deployment. A dev deploy is going to deploy the current project to an Azure development CDN for sharing builds with colleagues. The deploy Azure storage is going to upload assets to an Azure storage container, a blob store container specifically. And the package solution is going to package up your project into a SharePoint PKG file, an SPPKG file that you can then use to add to the app catalog. If you run gulp test, it's going to build and bundle the project and then run all of your tests to verify your code is working. Serve is going to build and bundle the project and then run the local web development server that hosts the local workbench. The last two commands are only really used one time when you set up your environment. So after you have installed all the tools, you then run gulp trust dev cert on the very first project you create. And what that does is that's going to configure your local machine to trust a self-signed SSL certificate that is used by the local web server to implement SSL on your local dev environment. So solution packaging works like this. Once I've created my project and everything's ready to go and I'm ready to deploy it, I then say gulp space package solution. And that's going to package up all the contents for what should be deployed to the server into an SPPKG file. This last bullet here, and those last two bullets here, talk about JavaScript files, CSS, and other assets that are not packaged, and they must be deployed to an external location such as a CDN. That's not exactly correct, because that's one option. That was originally what we had in V1 of the SharePoint framework, but in late 2017, Microsoft added an additional capability where we could then package up all of our assets like CSS and JavaScript would all be included inside of the package and deployed to the Office 365 CDN if we were using SharePoint Online and if the CDN was enabled in our tenant. So what are we going to create? Well, we can create web parts, and these are configurable, reusable, and purpose-built components. And it's going to give us also a framework for connecting related components. It's going to allow us to add functionality to SharePoint experiences and also be context aware of other things that are on the page. Now, client-side web parts, if you're familiar with server-side web parts, they work basically the same way as far as the end user is concerned. There's an area on the page that's carved out as a div, and then we're going to have control over what gets rendered inside that div. They're built to work in the modern JavaScript-driven web, but they will work also in classic pages. These things run directly inside of a SharePoint page, not on some other server or in some other environment, so we know we're getting the same context of the current user whenever we run the page, the web part on that page. So in this demo, we're going to look at how to create a SharePoint Framework client-side web part. Now we're going to see how to create a SharePoint Framework client-side web part using the SharePoint Framework tools that Microsoft has provided and leveraged from the open source community. This includes things like Yeoman, Node.js, NPM, and Gulp. We're going to start out by first going to our folder where I'm going to create my project, and I'll create a new folder here called First Web Part. I'm then going to run the Yeoman generator by saying yo, and then the generator that I want to run, which is Microsoft/SharePoint. And that's going to run the SharePoint Framework generator. It takes a moment for this to spin up, so I'm going to give it a second to spin up. Once it's started, we can go ahead and start entering in the information for the prompts that are being provided to us. So for solution name, I'll just leave it as the default of First Web Part. It's going to ask us what baseline packages we want to target. Now what this is asking is it's saying, are you working in an on-prem or in a SharePoint Online environment? If you're working in a SharePoint Online environment, you have access to the latest and greatest stuff. So it's not going to have any restrictions or any filtering based on what things are available to you. But if you're in an on-prem environment, there's only certain things that are available to us. For example, web parts are only available in SharePoint 2016, whereas client-side extensions are only available in SharePoint Online. So I'm going to choose SharePoint Online, and I'm going to say I want to put this project in the current folder because I created a folder and then went into it before I ran the generator. The other option is to let the generator create the subfolder for me. It then asked me this question about being a tenant admin and giving them the option to deploy to the solution to all the sites immediately without running any feature deployment. I'm going to click no here for now because I don't really need to worry about this. We'll deal with this in another module. What kind of a client-side component do I want to create? Well, we're doing something with web parts, so web part sounds good. What do you want to name it? Hello World sounds fine. The description, I don't really care, so we're just going to choose Hello World description. And we're going to stick with the no JavaScript framework for now. So I'm just going to leave it as that. Now when I do this, it's now going to provision out all the files, and we can see that if I open up VS Code. When VS Code opens, I'm going to go ahead and open up the project. So I'll say open folder and first web part and say select folder. So here I've got the default project experience that's been set up. We still have NPM in the background is downloading all the necessary packages, and those are all going to go inside this node modules folder. All right. Now we also have a config folder and we have a source folder, and in our source folder we have our web part right here as the Hello World web part. So it's inside of source source web parts Hello World web parts. You can ignore all these red squigglies that pop up by default because they're coming up there for a few reasons. For these first few here with these references, these red squigglies are showing up because it can't find a specific module. And the reason for that is because it's still downloading modules in the background. So we don't need to worry about that. Second of all, when you see this piece right here about looking for styles, as we talk about in the module here, the style sheet, this is actually referencing a JavaScript file right here. And this JavaScript file doesn't exist. It says it's a SAS file, but everything that when you see referencing specific files on the end, you can always assume that it implies .js or .ts. In our case here, it's referencing .js, and there's no such thing as a JavaScript file for this CSS module. But what's going to happen is that when I build the project, a lib folder is going to show up that's going to contain the JavaScript file for this, and then this will resolve just fine and we won't see this error anymore. Same thing with this.dom element. It doesn't know what this base class is because this base class is coming from this module up here. Properties, it doesn't know what that is for the same reason. So we can just ignore all that until this downloading all the packages completes. So now we're just going to wait for these packages to complete downloading. You can now see that everything has been downloaded just fine. I'm going to run a gulp build once the project has been completely built here. So it's going through, it's going to start building the project. And then once the project's been built, we see this lib folder. And inside this lib folder, we can see certain files. Like there's the SAS file right there that was generated to a CSS file. And then here's the JavaScript file that's being imported in. And we cover this in the module when we talk about CSS modules. But that's why now that this is being resolved now. These other pieces as well, they'll all resolve as well. It's just a little bit of a caching thing that VS Code's taking some time to catch up on. Let's make sure that everything works. I'm going to come back to my command prompt and I'm going to run a gulp serve. And this is going to, again, it's going to build the project, but it's also going to create a bundle. And then it's going to start up the local web server and it's going to host the local workbench and then load the workbench in the browser. And here I can come over here and click this plus sign and I can see hello world, and there's the web part that we just created. And we can also, furthermore, I can see things like if I come over here to the edit mode, I can change this hello world to be something like, say, hello SharePoint. And we can see how the text is changing without having to hit an apply button or anything. And the reason that's happening is over here that we have in the property pane, if I just scroll down a little bit, what we've done here is we've actually bound this property pane text field control to the description property. And this description property is defined right up here in this interface as a public property that's non-standard on the default base client-side web part. So this is a property that SharePoint is going to persist from when we edit the page to when we save it and go from page to page. So this description, you access this by saying this.properties. Properties is being defined by the interface that's passed into the base client-side web part. And we have a description property on this. And then it's just going to go through and write out this description property right here. We're using the escape function from the Lodash subset library that Microsoft has created for us to escape this text, to make sure that there's no like invalid HTML or any text in there that's going to mess up any of our HTML. Now, let's go and let's update the web part itself. Now, one of the nice things here is that as I make changes to the web part, we'll see the changes actually show up in the browser. So let me reorganize things a little bit. And let's put this browser over here, and I'll put the code over here. And I'm going to need to widen up the browser a little bit actually, because otherwise it's not going to render. And let's just shrink this up a little bit. And let me just show you something that we can do with this. So like we have welcome to SharePoint. Instead of saying customize web parts, let's say this is your first web part. Now, when I hit save, so I'll hit a Control S, what that is doing in the background is that's triggering the process to rebuild and rebuild the project and refresh the browser. And you can see here without doing anything, it refreshed the browser and I can see the text that showed up. So that makes our life a little bit easier here. Now, let's come over here and let's make another change. So I'm going to move these, shrink these guys up a little bit here, and we're not going to do this tiled experience here because we don't have enough real estate just because of the screen recording that we're working with. We're going to find this thing here with this href for this button that you see right here. I'm going to change this up. I'm going to change this up to put a hash sign here for this. And then I'm also going to go in and show you how we can attach like an event handler to this button. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down a little bit farther down here and I'll say this DOM element. And what that is that's referencing the div. The DOM element is referencing the div that's being put on the page where my entire web part is being added. So I'm going to say go to that div where the web part's being added. And then I'm going to want to get a reference to this button that you see here. So I'll say this DOM element, get elements by class name. And I'm going to say I want to get styles.button. And then once I've done that, I know it's going to give me a collection of elements that it finds. So I only want the first one because I know there's only one. And I'm going to add an event listener, a click event listener. And I'm going to say whenever that happens, you're going to pass an event into me. And I want you to run this code. And the code that we're going to run is something just very simple. We're going to say event prevent default. And what that's doing is that's going to say, when you click on this A link or this anchor tag, it's going to refresh the page because it thinks you're clicking on a link. Here I'm just saying, don't do whatever the default event would normally end up doing. Instead, we're going to run an alert that says, welcome to SharePoint Framework. I'm going to put a semicolon on the end and save our changes. So we'll let the project rebuild. We'll see the browser refresh in the background. And now when I click on this Learn More, I should get an alert that pops up and says, welcome to the SharePoint Framework. So this is just one way of setting up event handlers where I've added in an element to the page. And then I'm using the standard HTML DOM API to do some work with this. Now I'm going to go back and stop the command prompt here. So I'm going to go through and hit Control-C. I'm going to have to hit that twice. And now I've just stopped the web server from running. So we'll go ahead and close the browser in the background as well. Now let's modify the web parts public properties here. So if I come over here, go back to our manifest file here, this manifest.json, and let's open this up a little bit more so we can see what we're doing. What you're going to see here is a section where we have all these pre-configured entries. And one of the entries we have is this properties of a description. And what that's doing is that's giving us the ability to set the property that we want as the default value in that description property. So now instead of saying hello world, let's say hello universe, and we'll put a space in there. Another thing that we can do too is we can change the title of our web part. So I'm going to come over here and say, instead of it being hello world, we'll say hello SPFX. And in the description, it'll be my first SPFX web part. And for the icon that I want to use birthday cake. So the way I find this out is if I come over here and I open up the browser, and if I navigate to developer.microsoft.com/fabric, that's going to take me to the Office UI Fabric. And then under Styles, I can go to Icons, and I can find an icon that I want to use here. So like, for example, I can do a search for one called birthday cake. So there's this birthday cake right here. I'll double click on this text and copy it, and I'll paste it in right here. So instead of it being the page icon, I'm going to use the birthday cake option. So now I'm going to come over here and let's rerun our browser, run our web part. And now when I come over here to add my web part, we can see now it has a totally different description, name, and icon, and the default text is set to something different. So you can see I have a couple different options here of how I can go customize my web part, both the default options that you can see, as well as some of the stuff that you would see as the default text showing up on one of your public properties. In this section, we're going to look at testing the web part in the local and the hosted workbench options. Specifically, we're going to look at the local workbench, then we'll look at the hosted workbench, and then different modes of the gulp serve tasks that are available to us. The local workbench runs on HTTPS localhost, and it has no SharePoint context. This is a great way where developers can leverage and use mock data inside of your applications if you want to be able to test it without having access to real world SharePoint data. The hosted option is going to run on a real SharePoint site, and it's going to be located at whatever the URL of your site is, _layouts/workbench.aspx. It has SharePoint context and can leverage SharePoint data. And what that's going to allow us to do is to have a real solution that is one that we can test in like a real world environment. The SharePoint Workbench is a local development time experience that is allowing you to test your changes immediately, even if you're in, quote, offline mode. And offline being once you've got everything that you needed for your project, you can then test everything on your laptop without having an internet connection. So what's the debugging experience look like? Well, you're going to build and run on a local web server and which is going to automatically launch the local SharePoint Workbench by just saying gulp space serve. The other option you have is to build and run the solution on the local web server, but without launching the browser. And you can do that by putting the -- no browser option. This is useful when you want to work with the hosted workbench in SharePoint Online or in your SharePoint environment and not just on the local workbench. Now, the SharePoint Framework web parts are authored using TypeScript, and the build process is going to change the TypeScript or transpile the TypeScript into JavaScript and bundle it all into a single file. And as a result, it can be hard to debug the JavaScript and that is built or is generated in the build process. The source code mapping files make it possible to debug the original unbundled TypeScript code. And effectively, what it does is it's mapping every single line and all the code inside of a JavaScript file to the source line and code in a TypeScript file. So when I set a breakpoint on the JavaScript, it's really going to set a breakpoint on the TypeScript and map the two to each other. Now, how do we add a SharePoint Framework web part to a classic page? Well, you're going to go create a new wiki page, and then you can do that by opening up the Insert and then tab in the ribbon, and then selecting Add a Web Part. Now, you're going to find your web parts are going to be listed, your client-side web parts will be listed right alongside all the other web parts that are there. You're just going to want to be able to, there's nothing that's going to show you the difference that one is a client-side web part that was done with the SharePoint Framework and one is a classic web part, which is kind of nice because you don't want your users to have to know what the difference is. So here I've gone ahead and I've added in a SharePoint Framework web part to a classic page. Now, the difference on a modern page is that I'm going to first go in and create a new page. And then after I create that page, when it's in edit mode, I'm going to have this line going across the page with this circle with a plus inside of it. And what that's going to do is open up the tool bench when it's clicked on. From there, I can then select the item that I want to appear inside of that area, and it will get added to the page as you see here. So you get the exact same resulting experience by having your web part get added to the page, regardless of what kind of a page you're on, either the modern page or the classic page. Getting the web part on the page is the only thing that's different. In this demo, we're going to look at testing the web part in the local and in the hosted workbench. Let's see how we can work with both the local and the hosted SharePoint Workbench to test our web part and see different things, how we can use this in our standard developer experience. So I've got my project open that we had in the last demo. And the first thing we'll do here is I'm just going to run gulp serve. Now, I mentioned I'm going to show you here. I mentioned this in the last demo, but we're going to spend a little more time. I'm going to give you a little more information about how this works. Let's add our web part to the page. And let's go make a change to the code in the web part itself. So instead of it being my first web part, this will be my second web part. And I'm going to leave it just to go ahead and hit save. Now, what's happening here? What's happening is the gulp serve task has a watch flag that's been set on it, and it's watching for all the code files inside of our project for any changes. And this includes things like TypeScript, JavaScript, CSS, HTML, anything that's just real content or code. When it sees those changes, it's going to trigger the process to rebuild, bundle, and restart the web server. And it's using an internal tool that is connected to the browser that it can control it to say, I want it to refresh. And so that's how we're getting this nice experience of being in a debug mode and being able to see those changes. But I want you to notice one thing here. If I leave this window open, the command prompt, where we can see if things happen in the background, if I come over here to the manifest, and let's say instead of hello universe or hello world, we'll say hello galaxy, and save our changes, right? Now what you're noticing is you're seeing it change in the background, seeing that JSON file change in the background, but you're not seeing the web part change itself here. And the reason why you're not seeing that web part change itself is because this is this description field. Even if I refresh the page, the default value for this was already set when it was added to the page. If I remove it from the page, and then if I re-add it to the page, now we can still see the same name that's showing up here. But that's because this manifest file was created when SharePoint loaded the web part itself. So I delete it here, and now if I refresh the page, you'll see that it's still using the same value here. And that's because the manifest that's being returned by the local web server, it's not going to rebuild itself, or it's not going to rebuild the list of all the options that are available just when a JSON file changes. What we're going to have to do is you're going to have to stop the web server, and then when you spin it back up, then you would see your change. Now there's another way that we can run the gulp task here, and I can do something that says I can do a gulp serve -- no browser. And what that does is that's still going to spin up the local web server, and it's going to build a project, do the bundling, spin up the local web server, but it's not going to launch the browser for us. It's going to leave it closed. And you may wonder, well, why are we doing that? What's the use there? Well, maybe there's a case where I don't want to launch the local web server. Instead, what I want to go is I want to use my hosted workbench in SharePoint Online. So let's take a look at how that works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here to the browser, and I'm going to go to my sharepoint.com/site/dev site. And I'm going to go ahead and, after logging in, I'm going to navigate over here to _layouts/workbench.aspx. Now, before I do this, I want you to keep, let's change the URL here. Let's change the browser's layout a little bit. And watch over here in the background. Even though I'm clearly not on my local machine right here, when I run this, I want you to see that it's going to report that it's being hit by something. It's requesting some files. So notice here it requested manifest.js. Now what that's doing then is it's not only going to show me all the stuff that's available to me in SharePoint Online, but it's also going to show me my web part that's running locally on my local server, on localhost. Now if I select this, you'll see over here in the left-hand side, you'll see a request come up for the files related to my web part. There's the bundle that's being requested. There's the localized strings that are being requested. And this is all showing up in my SharePoint Online environment. The reason why this is happening is because what the Workbench does in SharePoint Online is it's not only going to get a list of all of the elements that are available to me in SharePoint Online that are installed inside this tenant, but it's also going to say, give me the local manifest file to show me stuff that you want to test. So I can prove this by, if I come over here and remove this web part, and if I shut down the local web server, and if I refresh the Workbench, you're going to see it's going to give me an error or a little warning and saying, I'm expecting something else to be here. There, so it wasn't patient enough. There. So it says your web part's not going to appear in the toolbox. Make sure that gulp serve is running. But really what it's saying is I'm trying to hit the manifest file on localhost, on your local machine, and I can't hit it. And so therefore I can't show you anything that's running off your local machine, because the local workbench or the hosted workbench in SharePoint Online is designed to be used with SharePoint. It was designed to be used with your any local development that you are doing. And so that's a little bit of a difference between the hosted workbench and the local workbench. In this last section, we're going to explore some different aspects to the SharePoint Framework APIs. There are a lot of little pieces here that you're going to want to take a look at. We're going to look at page status, environment type, logging, and loading indicators. So first, let's talk about some utilities. The SharePoint Framework includes many utility libraries that make developing SharePoint Framework components easier for developers. To use these utilities, you simply have to import the appropriate utility library. It may or may not be necessary. It may already be there. And then you're going to need to just call the methods on those libraries. So one thing we have are status renderers, and we can use these when a web part is loading information from SharePoint or external locations, or to display errors if a web part runs into issues that could prevent it from working properly. This is available via the web part context property, and it's going to use the entire web part user experience. Loading indicators are useful when you're indicating that you're loading content in your web part. Error indicators, those are for when you have errors. This is what a loading indicator looks like. You're going to display the loading indicator by simply calling display loading indicator, and then you're going to clear it or remove it by saying clear loading indicator. So here we're first clearing it to make sure there's nothing there, passing in the DOM element where we want to display it, and then we're going to display it by saying display loading indicator with a message at the end. So we can see loading message. An error indicator, we can do the same thing where we have a clear error and a render error, and we're going to pass in an error object. Notice that the first parameter that's being passed in is the DOM element. So where should the error message be displayed? Now, there's a very popular library called Lodash that's available on the internet, and it's a fairly big library, but what Microsoft has done is they've created a subset of the Lodash library that contains some really common things that you end up wanting to use. Things like find index and escape. And what you can do here is you'll be able to leverage this by including it in your project. So here you can see that I'm importing the Microsoft/SP Lodash subset library. And I'm specifically importing two methods or two functions from that library, the escape function and the find index function. And you can see in the references in the code where that's being used. We can also determine the display mode of a page. So for a classic page, pages in a web part can be in different modes. So a web part can be in an edit mode and in a display mode, even if the page is in edit mode or display. A modern page, it doesn't work like that. The page and the web part are always in the same mode. If the page is in edit mode, all the web parts are currently in edit mode as well. The way you're going to determine this is by looking at the display mode on the web part context itself, or on the web part itself, by saying this.display mode, and it's going to give you back an option from an enumeration called display mode that's in the SP Core library package. So let's talk about different display modes. So for a classic page, we have a page is not in edit mode. So here we can see that we're not in edit mode on the top left-hand side. And then we have another one where the page is in edit mode and the web part is also not in edit mode. Now here on the right-hand side, we can see where the page is in edit mode and the web part will also be in edit mode. It's not, we don't have a difference between the two experiences. It's just one experience. However, on a modern page, it doesn't exist like that. The page display mode is always going to be the same as the web part display mode. So if the page is in edit mode, the web part's in edit mode as well. Let's talk about the page context. Now this is available with some mock data if I'm working in the local workbench, but you get the full data available to it if you're in the SharePoint Online workbench. Things that you get are things like the current site's title that we're in, the absolute URL of the current site, the relative URL of the current site, and the user's current login name. And all of that's going to be available to you on the page context object. If you're on the local workbench, you get some mocked up data. So here's a web part running in the local workbench. You can see it's telling me that I'm in the local workbench. And then here you have one where I'm running in the SharePoint Online workbench, and we can see that we're running inside of a team site. Now another thing we can check on is the environment type, and this is going to be used to determine where a web part is running. This allows us to detect if we're in the local workbench or in a real SharePoint environment like the hosted workbench. And I can do that by looking at the current environment type that we're currently in. So I can say environment.type using the environment object from the SP Core library package. And I can check to see if it's of type local, and if it is, then I know that I'm running in my local workbench. So here you can see where it's displaying that I'm either in my local workbench or I'm in a real SharePoint environment. And this is useful if you're doing things like if you have mock data that you're going to test in the local workbench. So now let's talk a little bit about logging. The SharePoint framework includes a built-in logging mechanism, and all logging is output to the JavaScript console. You've got 4 static logging methods available of info, warn, error, and verbose, and the descriptions are pretty self-explanatory on what these do. The logging methods are also going to share the same signature. There's 3 parameters you're going to pass in. You have a source parameter, which allows you to define the source of the logging information, such as the method name or the class name. You've got a message, which is the actual message that you want to display, and then a scope, which allows you to define optionally a service scope. The error method takes an error object instead of a message string that's being passed in. And we'll see this when we do the demo. So here you can see where I've got I'm importing the log object from the SP Core library package, and I'm running these 3 different commands. So I've got the hello world component, and that hello world component, I'm using an info or a warn or an error or a verbose message. You can see a bunch of different options there. Notice the error is passing in an error object instead of passing in a string. Now, what if I want to load a JavaScript or a CSS file from somewhere else on the internet at runtime? So this would be useful if I'm going to be importing like a CSS class from some external resource, like if I'm using the jQuery UI library that is expecting me to use different CSS files. I can do that using a thing called the component loader, or the SP component loader. This is located in the SP loader package. So here I'm going to run SP component loader.load script, and I'm going to give it the URL of the script and then the object that I want it to be defined as or loaded into. So in this case here, you can see I'm loading jQuery. Here you can see I'm loading jQuery into using the component loader, which is going to return a promise, and then from there I can work with that promise by saying .then the thing that's passed in is jQuery, and then I'm loading in the jQuery UI CSS file once I've loaded in the jQuery library. Let's take a look at how we can work with these different APIs from the SharePoint framework in a demo. Now we're going to take a look at exploring some different components from the SharePoint framework API. Now we've already gone ahead and coded up these things, so I'm just going to walk you through the resulting example from this. And there's a lab exercises associated with this module that'll walk you through doing everything that you see here. So the first thing is that we can look at is checking the current page mode and page state. So the way that I'm doing that is up here, you can see that I've taken the from the SP code library, I've added in a couple additional import statements where I'm importing the display mode, environment, environment type, and log. Now where we're using the display mode is right down here inside the web part. So here, let's go ahead and break these up on a separate line so you can see them a little bit easier. Here for the page mode, I'm checking to see, looking at the web part itself, I'm looking at the current display mode and I'm checking to see if we're currently in edit mode. And if I am, I'm setting the text here for page mode to you're in edit mode, or I'm setting it to you're in read mode. And here is where we're going to write this out. So if I come over here to my web part and I add my web part to the page, and I have to give it a second here because we have a loading message, and I'll show you where we're using that in just a few minutes. Here we can see that we're currently in edit mode. If I was no longer in edit mode and I actually saved the page here and I got out of edit mode here, then this would instead show me that I was currently in read mode. Another thing that we can do here is I'm checking the environment that I'm in. So here again, I have another ternary expression set up that checks to see what is my current environment type. So from saying the current environment type, if it's equal to local, then I say I'm in my local environment. Otherwise, I say I'm in my SharePoint Online environment. Well, I'm clearly in my SharePoint Online environment that you see right here. So you can see that it's showing me that I'm in my SharePoint Online environment. But when I come over here to the workbench itself, to the local workbench, and I add the same web part to the page, we can see that it's showing me that I'm in my local environment. So I'm a way to check to see either one, if I'm in local or if I'm in edit mode as well here. Now we can also use this logging API that I mentioned in the slides part of this module. So you see I'm importing the log statement right here. If I scroll down, you can see I've got 4 log messages that I'm writing out: info, warn, error, and verbose. And what I'm doing is I'm saying that they're all coming from Hello World. They each have a message, and I'm using the current service scope, which is just something it's like a cookie cutter code. You'd always put that in there. So if I come back over here to the browser, let's go ahead and open this up, the dev tools up to see the console. And I'm going to go over here to the console, and once the web part loads, you can see here that I'm getting my Hello World message showing up right here. I have another one with a warning showing up. I have an error message that's showing up here, and I'm seeing the verbose message showing up. And notice it's showing me a little bit of a prefix here of an instance of the web part, plus I'm saying this is coming from Hello World. And then it's writing out my message. Now, you've seen from this web part that when this web part is loading on the page, you're seeing this loading animation showing up first with a loading message, and then after a few seconds, it's going away and it's showing me the web part. So let me show you how we're doing that. So if I come up back up here, I'm calling on the current context of the web part. I'm saying display the loading indicator for this current element, so the div that the web part is being rendered in, and put message in there as the text. So I'm showing it, and then I'm saying now I'm going to set a timeout, that I want to clear the loading indicator on this element, and I'm then going to want to run this code to change what's in it. And at the end of the timeout, I want that to finish 5 seconds later. So I'm going to say, set a timeout that when 5 seconds expires, I want you to run all of this code. So it will clear the loading indicator out, and in this same DOM element, it'll rewrite what's inside the div to replace the loading indicator. And you've seen how that works. And so this is just a little tour of a couple of the different pieces that we have, nice little utilities we have for the SharePoint API, SharePoint Framework API that you can take advantage of within your web parts. In this section, we looked at the page status, the environment type, logging, and some loading indicators as well inside of our project. I hope you enjoyed this module in learning how to work with web parts and how to work with the different SharePoint Framework APIs. In future modules, we'll dive into more details about working with the SharePoint Framework. Thank you.